When HOA inspectors rammed through my grandfather's 40-year-old fence and called it a blessing in disguise, they had no idea what was coming. The 78-year-old sugarcane farmer just smiled, fired up his massive loader, and taught them a lesson they'd never forget: 8 feet off the ground. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe or more stories. The sound of splintering wood and crumpling metal still echoes in my mind whenever I think about that blazing hot Tuesday in July. What started as another ordinary morning in our small Louisiana town turned into the kind of story that gets passed down through generations. The day my 78-year-old grandfather went to war with the Magnolia Springs Homeowners Association, and won in the most spectacular way imaginable. My name is Jake, and I'd been living with my grandfather, Earl Thompson, for about 6 months after losing my job in the city. Grandpa Earl wasn't just any ordinary retiree. He was a third-generation sugarcane farmer who'd worked the same 200-acre plot of land for over 50 years. His weathered hands told stories of countless harvests, and his eyes held the wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of honest work under the Louisiana sun. The trouble began when our quiet farming community started attracting wealthy retirees from up north. They came with their big retirement accounts and even bigger opinions about how our quaint little town should look. Before we knew it, they'd formed the Magnolia Springs HOA and somehow managed to get our property, which had been in our family since 1952, included in their jurisdiction through some legal loophole involving a boundary rezoning that happened while Grandpa was recovering from hip surgery. Bunch of city folk who don't know a cotton plant from a cornstalk trying to tell me how to run my land, Grandpa would mutter every time he got one of their violation notices in the mail. The notices started small. Our mailbox was non-regulation height. Our fence needed to be professionally painted. Our farm equipment was unsightly and needed to be properly stored out of view. Each notice came with increasingly steep fines and threats of legal action. The real trouble began with our perimeter fence, a sturdy wooden barrier that Grandpa had built himself in 1985 to keep deer out of his sugarcane fields. It wasn't fancy, but it was functional and had stood strong for nearly 40 years. The HOA declared it aesthetically incompatible with community standards, and demanded we replace it with a regulation white vinyl fence, at our own expense, a cost of nearly $15,000 for our large property perimeter. We tried reasoning with them. Grandpa even attended one of their monthly meetings, wearing his best church shirt and speaking respectfully about the fence's history and functionality. The HOA president, a stern woman named Margaret Whitmore who'd moved down from Connecticut, dismissed his concerns with a wave of her manicured hand. "Mr. Thompson, we're trying to maintain property values here. Your rustic farming aesthetic simply doesn't align with our vision for the community." 3 weeks later, we received a certified letter that made my blood boil. The HOA was exercising their right of inspection, and would be conducting a thorough property assessment the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. sharp. We were required to provide full access to all areas of the property, including buildings, equipment, and agricultural areas. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes Louisiana summers legendary. By 9:30 a.m., the temperature was already pushing 95 degrees, and the humidity made it feel like breathing through a wet towel. Grandpa and I were in the equipment barn, doing our usual morning maintenance on the sugarcane loader, a massive piece of machinery that looked like a cross between a crane and a bulldozer. This particular loader was Grandpa's pride and joy, a restored 1970s model that could lift, load, and move tons of harvested sugarcane with surgical precision. At exactly 10 a.m., we heard vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs pulled into our gravel driveway, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on their pristine paint jobs. Out stepped Margaret Whitmore and 4 other HOA board members, all dressed like they were heading to a country club luncheon rather than inspecting a working farm. Behind them came 2 more vehicles, a pickup truck with property assessment services, painted on the side, and another SUV with what appeared to be a lawyer in an expensive suit. What followed was the most insulting 2 hours of my life. These people poked, prodded, photographed, and criticized every aspect of our family's property like they were documenting a crime scene. They declared our equipment shed a blight on the landscape. Our compost pile was deemed a health hazard. The small workshop where Grandpa repaired equipment was labeled an unpermitted structure. Even our vegetable garden, which supplied fresh produce to half the elderly folks in town, was cited as an unauthorized agricultural use in a residential zone. But the worst part was how they talked about Grandpa. Not to him, but about him as if he wasn't standing right there. "Look at this rust on these farming implements," one assessor said to another. "The property owner clearly has no regard for maintenance." Grandpa's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. 78 years of dealing with difficult people had taught him patience. But I could see the storm building behind his eyes. The breaking point came when they reached our perimeter fence. "This fence is even worse than we thought," Margaret announced, running her finger along one of the weathered wooden posts. "The wood is graying, there are gaps between some boards, and look at these rusty nails. This is exactly the kind of eyesore that brings down everyone's property values." "Ma'am," Grandpa said quietly, "that fence has been standing strong for 40 years. It's kept deer out of my crops and marked my property line through 3 hurricanes. The wood may be weathered, but it's solid cedar. Those rusty nails are galvanized steel, and they're not rusty, they're patinated." Margaret waved his explanation away. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sure you're very proud of your handiwork, but this fence simply has to go." That's when Grandpa's voice dropped to the tone I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "And if I refuse?" Margaret smiled, the cold, calculating smile of someone who thought they held all the cards. "Then we'll obtain a court order and have it removed at your expense. Plus legal fees, of course." What happened next still seems surreal. One of the assessors, a skinny guy with a clipboard who'd been particularly obnoxious all morning, decided he needed to properly document the fence's structural deficiencies. He climbed into one of the HOA's black SUVs and announced he was going to drive along the fence line to photograph it from multiple angles. "Sir," Grandpa called out, "I wouldn't recommend driving in that area. The ground's soft from yesterday's irrigation, and there are some equipment ruts that I think I can handle driving around a farm." "Old man," the assessor interrupted. That was his biggest mistake. The assessor gunned the SUV's engine and started driving parallel to our fence, about 3 feet away from it. He was taking photos out his window while driving, not paying attention to where he was going. The soft ground that Grandpa had warned about caught the vehicle's right side tires, and suddenly the SUV lurched sideways. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as the SUV's rear quarter panel caught 3 fence posts and dragged them down, taking about 20 feet of fencing with it. The assessor threw the SUV in reverse, trying to back away from the damage, but that only made things worse. The fence posts caught under his rear bumper, and when he accelerated, he ripped down another section of fence. In less than 30 seconds, this idiot had destroyed nearly 50 feet of the fence that had stood strong for 4 decades. Everyone stood frozen, staring at the destruction. Then Grandpa spoke, his voice deadly calm. "Well, I'll be damned." He walked over to examine the damage, running his weathered hands along the broken posts and scattered boards. Each piece of destroyed fencing represented hours of his labor, years of his craftsmanship. Margaret tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Thompson will certainly pay for the damage, but this doesn't change the fact that your fence was non-compliant to begin with. Perhaps this is actually a blessing in disguise. Now you can install a proper vinyl fence that meets our standards." That's when I saw something change in Grandpa's eyes. The storm I'd been watching build all morning was finally ready to break. "A blessing in disguise," he repeated slowly. "Well, Ms. Whitmore, since you seem to think destroying my property is such a blessing, let me show you what a real blessing looks like." Grandpa walked calmly back toward the equipment barn and I followed, still recording everything on my phone. "Jake," Grandpa said quietly as we reached the barn, "remember when you asked me last week why I keep this old loader in such perfect condition even though we only use it during harvest season? Yeah, you said you never know when you might need heavy equipment on a farm. That's right. Today we need heavy equipment." He climbed up into the operator's seat of the massive sugarcane loader with an agility that belied his age. The machine roared to life with a deep, diesel rumble that made the ground vibrate. The sugarcane loader was an impressive machine, 12 feet tall, with hydraulic arms capable of lifting several tons and tracks that could navigate any terrain. When Grandpa drove it out of the barn, the diesel engine's roar made everyone in the yard turn and stare. Margaret and her crew watched nervously as Grandpa maneuvered the massive machine across the yard. He had 70 years of experience operating heavy equipment, and it showed in the precise, almost graceful way he controlled the loader. "Mr. Thompson," Margaret called out, her voice higher than usual, "what exactly are you doing?" "Just conducting an inspection, ma'am," Grandpa called back over the engine noise. "Same as what you folks have been doing all morning." He positioned the loader directly behind the SUV that had demolished our fence. The machine's hydraulic arm extended downward, and the large scoop attachment hovered inches above the SUV's roof. "Now," Grandpa continued conversationally, "this vehicle appears to have some significant safety violations. Let me document them properly." The assessor who'd been driving the SUV started backing away from his vehicle. "Hey, wait a minute. You can't what?" Grandpa asked innocently. Inspect your property for violations? Isn't that exactly what you've been doing to me for the past 2 hours? What happened next was both terrifying and beautiful to watch. Grandpa lowered the loader's scoop with surgical precision, sliding it under the rear of the SUV just behind the back wheels. The hydraulic arms engaged with a smooth, powerful motion, and suddenly the SUV's back end was lifting off the ground. "Mr. Thompson, put that vehicle down immediately," Margaret shrieked. "Well now, ma'am, I'm just trying to get a better look at the undercarriage," Grandpa replied calmly. "Seems this vehicle has some serious structural problems." He continued lifting until the SUV was tilted at about a 30-degree angle, its front wheels still on the ground but its rear end suspended 8 feet in the air. The vehicle's contents, clipboards, papers, coffee cups, and various inspection equipment, went sliding forward against the windshield. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when someone's lifted an HOA SUV 8 feet off the ground with a sugarcane loader. Within minutes, neighbors started arriving to see what all the commotion was about. Soon half the neighborhood was standing in our yard watching the show. And the amazing thing was they were all on Grandpa's side. "About time someone stood up to these HOA busybodies," called out Tom Martinez. Even Sheriff Deputy Williams, who arrived in response to the assessor's frantic phone call, seemed to be fighting back a smile as he assessed the situation. "Earl," Deputy Williams said, walking over to the loader, "what exactly are we doing here?" "Just conducting a property inspection, Bobby," Grandpa replied. Deputy Williams had grown up in town and had known Grandpa for 40 years. "These folks spent all morning inspecting my property, so I figured I'd return the favor." Margaret Whitmore was absolutely beside herself. Her carefully planned inspection had turned into a public spectacle, with half the town watching one of their most respected residents hold an HOA vehicle hostage with farm equipment. "Deputy Williams," she demanded, "arrest this man immediately." "Ma'am," Deputy Williams interrupted, "I don't see any destroyed property. The vehicle appears to be intact and safely supported. As for threats, Mr. Thompson hasn't threatened anyone. He's just conducting an inspection." Just then Jim Bradley, the town's only lawyer, walked across the yard with a big grin on his face. "Actually," he said, "Earl has every legal right to inspect any vehicle that has caused damage to his property before allowing it to leave the premises. It's right there in your HOA bylaws, Section 12.3. Margaret's face went white. The crowd was growing larger and more people were pulling out their phones to record the scene. Margaret realized she was facing a public relations disaster. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice strained, "what exactly do you want?" Grandpa sat in the loader's operator seat, looking for all the world like a king on his throne. "Well, Ms. Whitmore, I want the same thing I've wanted all along, to be left alone to run my farm in peace. We can discuss reducing some of the violations, all of them," Grandpa interrupted. "Every single citation, every fine, every demand for changes to my property. All of it goes away. That's impossible. We have standards to maintain." Grandpa shrugged and reached for the hydraulic controls. "Then I guess my inspection is going to take a while longer." The SUV tilted another few degrees. All right," Margaret shouted. "We'll withdraw the current violations. But the fence still needs to be replaced." "You're absolutely right," Grandpa agreed. "And since your driver tore it down during your official HOA inspection, I figure your HOA insurance should cover the full cost of replacement. Plus materials upgrade. A nice cedar fence with proper hardware would run about $8,000. Professional installation adds another $3,000. Jim Bradley stepped forward with a folder full of documents. "Actually, Margaret, there's something else you should know. Earl's property was never legally included in your HOA jurisdiction. He has a grandfathered agricultural exemption from 1952 that supersedes any HOA authority." The silence that followed was broken only by the diesel engine of the sugarcane loader. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. "I'm afraid not," Jim continued. "Your HOA has been operating outside its legal authority for months. Every citation you've sent to Earl is not only invalid, it's harassment." The negotiation that followed was swift and decisive. With their vehicle suspended in the air, half the town watching and their legal position crumbling, the HOA had no choice but to accept Grandpa's terms. They would pay for the complete replacement of the damaged fence, formally acknowledge that our property was outside their jurisdiction, pay a settlement for months of harassment, and issue a public apology. The hydraulic arms lowered slowly, gently setting the SUV back on solid ground. The assessor climbed out on wobbly legs, looking like he'd just survived a roller coaster ride. The vehicle was completely undamaged. Grandpa's 40 years of heavy equipment experience had ensured that. As the HOA crew packed up and left, the assembled crowd burst into applause. The story of Grandpa's stand against the HOA spread like wildfire. The video I'd recorded went viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of comments supporting Grandpa's actions. Grandpa became something of a folk hero, the elderly farmer who'd stood up to bureaucratic bullying and won. The new fence was installed 3 weeks later, beautiful cedar construction that made the old fence look shabby by comparison. The HOA paid every penny without complaint. Margaret Whitmore resigned from the HOA board a month later and moved back to Connecticut. 2 months after the great SUV lifting, as it came to be known around town, Grandpa decided to throw a harvest party. The entire neighborhood came and we served sweet corn, tomatoes and watermelon from our formerly unauthorized vegetable garden. As the sun set over the sugarcane fields, I found Grandpa sitting on the porch with a satisfied smile. "Any regrets, Grandpa?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "You know, Jake, I spent 67 years working this land, and in all that time, I never once lifted another man's vehicle with my equipment. And I'm wondering why it took me so long to try it. That was the most fun I've had in years." We sat in comfortable silence, watching our neighbors enjoy the harvest from the garden that the HOA had tried to eliminate. "Grandpa," I said eventually, "what would have happened if you'd just gone along with their demands?" He shook his head slowly. "Jake, there's something important you need to understand about bullies, whether they're playground bullies or grown-ups with clipboards and legal threats. Give them what they want and they don't go away satisfied. They just come back asking for more. Sometimes you have to show people that you can't be pushed around, even if it means lifting their SUV 8 feet off the ground to make your point." The real victory wasn't just in the viral video or the beautiful new fence. It was in what happened to our community afterward. Other neighborhoods started pushing back against unreasonable HOA demands. People began attending board meetings, asking questions, demanding accountability. The culture of fear that had allowed the worst HOA abuses to flourish began to crumble. 6 months later, I was still living with Grandpa, but now by choice. The sugarcane loader sat in the barn, maintained in perfect condition as always, but now it carried legendary status in town. Parents would point it out to their children, telling them the story of the day Earl Thompson stood up to the bullies and won. On the first anniversary of the great SUV lifting, the local elementary school invited Grandpa to speak to their students about standing up to bullies. At the end, one little girl raised her hand. "Mr. Earl, did you really pick up their car with your tractor?" Grandpa grinned. "Yes, I did. And sometimes when someone's being a bully, you have to show them that you're not afraid." That night, as we sat on the porch watching another Louisiana sunset, Grandpa turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Jake, you know what I learned from all this? Sometimes the best way to preserve something old and valuable is to fight for it. That fence may be gone, but what it represented, our family's history, our right to live how we choose, that's stronger than ever." He was right. What Grandpa had fought for was something precious. The right to be yourself, to be proud of honest work, and to stand up to those who would try to make you feel small. And that lesson, lifted 8 feet in the air by a sugarcane loader on a hot July morning, would be remembered in our little town for generations to come.